Okay, thank you. So listening to the conversations that you were having, I think that most of the conversations focus around two strong themes, I think, around risk-taking. One is lowering the stakes of risk-taking. So basically making it a bit less scary to take, what happens when things go wrong. And the other is almost normalizing it by actually making it a part of the normal activity of the school. But here's a trap that I've seen in risk-taking. If you encourage people to take risks, the thing you don't want to do is to praise people if the risk pays off. Because that's just luck. If it was genuinely scary and risky, if you knew whether it was going to work, if you knew it was going to work, it wouldn't be a risk. So the point is they did this not knowing whether it was going to work or not. And if you praise them for being successful, you're saying, take whatever risks you like, but don't screw up. So the important point is, if we want teachers to take risks, we should praise them for taking smart, sensible risks, not for the outcome. And the other thing is, often team teaching, planning it with somebody else, so that if it doesn't work out, it's not one person's fault. And that's why the idea of working collaboratively is so important. So those appear to be the two things that will help. And just a quick reminder of why people shouldn't work on their own. Only 2% of high school seniors believe their leadership skills are below average. 25% of high school seniors believe they're in the top 1% in their ability to get on with others. 95% of Americans and 69% of Swedes think they're better than average drivers. 94% of college professors report doing above average quality work. People think they're at lower risk than their peers for stroke, heart attack, food poisoning, cancer, and so on. Strangers predict your IQ better than you do. But the one I love, people think they are better than their peers at accurate self-assessment. We're not very good at judging ourselves. And that's why professional learning communities can be so powerful. So the idea of professional learning communities is that we create a forum for people to actually get the support of their colleagues. Now, the term professional learning community has almost lost its usefulness because it's been so hyped. So, for example, the National College for School Leadership in England defined a PLC as an inclusive group of people motivated by a shared learning vision who support and work with each other, finding ways inside and outside their immediate community to inquire on their practice and together learn new and better approaches that will enhance all people's learning. And when they've done that, they're going to find a cure for cancer and solve world hunger. The problem with that definition, it's sort of motherhood and apple pie. It's just so open that it's not useful. According to this definition, two teachers bumping into each other in a corridor and exchanging tips on teaching would qualify it. So the point is, we need a good definition of PLCs. And I'm a kind of literal person, so I think a professional learning community should be professional. It should be learning. You're way ahead of me on this one. And it should be a community. So here's the point. What is a profession? Well, I think a profession has two defining characteristics. One is you never have enough information. You're always making decisions under conditions of uncertainty. If you have all the information you need, you're a technician, not a professional. And the second condition is, although you have to make decisions under conditions of uncertainty, you expect your decisions to be scrutinized by a community of your peers. You are still, in some way, accountable or responsible to a community of your peers. Now, a professional learning community of accountants would presumably be trying to get better at accounting. A professional learning community of teachers should be trying to get better at teaching. And that's why I think that if your job is helping students do things they couldn't do before, you're a teacher. I don't care whether your title is a learning support officer or a teaching assistant. I don't care what your title is. If your job is helping kids do things they couldn't do before, you're a teacher. And if you're not doing that job, then you're not a teacher. So the important point is, if you're focused on improving outcomes for young people, then this PLC is trying to get better at that. In terms of the word community, I think that the definition by Etienne Wenger, who with Jean Lave coined the term communities of practice, who's probably done more thinking about this than anybody else, he suggests there are three characteristics of a community. The first one is joint enterprise. We're working on the same thing here. It's not as if we bring our own knitting and sit in a group and happen to do our own knitting. We're working on the same ideas. The second is mutual engagement. I get into your business and you get into mine. So we don't get to say, well, that's just your opinion, because you have to deal with the people's commentary on your proposed course of action. And then shared repertoire. Over time, people develop a shared language, a shared set of ideas that actually defines the community. We talk about things in similar ways. And that's what I'm thinking we need to have to really improve practice in Scottish schools. We need to create time and place for teachers to reflect on their practice and learn from mistakes. And I think mistakes are important. Obviously, there's no excuse for making the same mistake over and over again, but I would say there's no excuse for making no mistakes at all. As Mario Andretti, the racing driver, used to say, if everything seems under control, you're not going fast enough. We have to go for it. We have to try. And that's why I like Esther Dyson's motto, always make new mistakes. Let's make new mistakes today. But I think Samuel Beckett summed it up best in his book, Worsted Hoe, where he said, ever tried, ever failed, no matter, try again, fail better. That's your job as leaders. Every day to fail slightly better than you did. I mean, we're going to fail. This job we do as teachers is impossible. You show me a teacher who thinks she's doing a good job, I will show you a teacher who is either not paying attention or has very low expectations of her students. We have such high expectations of our students, we want them to succeed so badly, we're always going to be failing. They're always going to be falling short of what we hope for our students. But the idea is you can bounce back and say, what else can I try? This makes teaching different from most other professions. You see, once you qualify as an accountant in the UK, as long as you keep abreast of current legislation, there is no requirement to be any better than you were on your first day as an accountant. I bought a house a few years ago. I got a lawyer to do the legal work. She did it perfectly. She couldn't have done any more. About 25 years ago, I had a rather serious motorcycle accident. A car came from a side street without looking, hit my left leg, severed 4 tendons, an artery, and a nerve. But the surgeon fixed my leg. It now works perfectly. He couldn't have done any more. No teacher ever gets to say that. No teacher gets to say, we did all we could for this child, but in the end it wasn't enough. Because you can always do more. And that's why I think the other professions are a very poor model for teaching. Because all that surgeon did with my leg was to get it back to how it was before. And that's not what you're doing. What you're doing is opening up untold possibilities for your students. And that's why we can never rest. We will fail, but the important point is we bounce back. It turns out to be the most motivating thing in the world. Teresa Amabile is the Dean of Research at the Harvard Business School, and she's studied people's motivation in the business world. She asked people to keep diaries. You know, was today a good day or a bad day? If it was a good day, why was it a good day? If it was a bad day, why was it a bad day? And what she saw was that pay rises, bonuses, those things didn't actually make people feel very good. The thing that made people feel really good about their jobs, the power of small wins. That's what she called them. Like getting a spreadsheet to do what it's meant to do. Like getting people who've been bickering to talk constructively. And that's why teachers are blessed. Because the average teacher has more opportunities for small wins in a typical working day than most people get in a month. And it's really important in terms of performance-related pay. Teachers aren't motivated by money. You need to pay teachers. They do like to get paid, I've discovered. But the point is, if you keep on talking about the money, it gets in the way of them being creative. That's what the research on motivation shows. Extrinsic rewards make performance worse in high complexity, high creativity tasks. Because people get locked into pursuing ineffective strategies more aggressively in pursuit of the reward. That's why one of the really important jobs you do is to focus on the learning, to focus on the improvement. The rewards are those small wins. And that's why teacher learning communities can be so important. Now, I want to explain why I distinguish between professional learning communities and teacher learning communities. A professional learning community, I've just defined. A teacher learning community is a special kind of professional learning community where the only members are still teaching. So with the Tapestry Partnership, we run groups for teachers developing assessment tools. I think it's perfectly appropriate to have an outside facilitator for those groups because technical expertise is quite useful to those groups. So I'd call those professional learning communities. What I'm suggesting is when teachers are trying to improve their practice, trying to actually wrestle with acquiring a new technique, I think it's really valuable if the group consists entirely of people who are still teaching. Now, if you're a head who no longer teaches, I'm afraid you have zero credibility as a practitioner. I think you basically have you have credibility for about 6 weeks after you stop teaching full time. But after 6 weeks, you have this rosy view of all the things you would have done differently, and you didn't because it's just too bloody difficult. So what I'm suggesting is if you want these groups to be as powerful as they can be, you need not to be there. If you're a head who still teaches, then you could be there. But remember, you're there as an ordinary teacher, not as a head. Now, in some schools, particularly in small rural schools, where the head is just one of the team, I understand the temptation to be there. But the point is this: if you are there as a head, you will change the meeting. It doesn't matter what you think you're like. What matters is what they think you're. I used to run a university, and people described me as scary. I thought I was cuddly. I didn't think I was scary. But the point is, because I was sitting in a job that gave me a lot of power over people's futures, they thought I was scary. And nothing I could say would change that. And in the same way, nothing you can say will change your teacher's perception of you if you're in those meetings and you will actually change the meeting. I'm not saying it'll always be for the worst, but you won't get that honesty. You won't get that really robust conversation between teachers where they're calling each other when they're actually pretending they're doing something when they're really not. So, the big idea here is changing, not sharing practice. So I think one of the big distractions we've had over the last 20 years in the UK is the idea of sharing good practice. And I think it hasn't worked because teachers have got more than enough examples of good practice. Teachers have got more examples of good practice from other teachers' classrooms than they can deal with in a lifetime. Teachers love visiting other people's classrooms. It doesn't change their practice. That's the problem. And as I said, as I promised earlier, we have to understand the research on habit change. And there's a very nice book on habit change written by Chip and Daniel Heath called Switch. And what they've done, it's a very readable book. What they've done is taken all the research on habit change and distilled it into 9 strategies for habit change. 3 are around the rational side, what they call direct the rider. So the metaphor is a rider on an elephant going around a city landscape. The rider's in charge, very rational. The elephant's very emotional. The path constrains what they can do. So the 9 strategies are as follows. Follow the bright spots. Jerry and Monique Sternin were posted by Save the Children to Vietnam. And of course their concern was for outcomes for young children in this village. Malnutrition was a real issue. And of course the usual things, better sanitation, more money, couldn't do anything about it. What they noticed was that some children didn't have much malnutrition. So they talked to the mothers about what they were doing differently. The mothers were going into the forest and collecting some greens. They were also using freshwater shrimp and adding that to the children's diet, even though these were regarded as inappropriate for young children. And they fed their babies 4 times a day rather than twice a day. And if the baby had diarrhea, they carried on feeding it, even though the local tradition was if a baby had diarrhea, you shouldn't feed the baby. So what did Jerry Sternin do? He didn't tell other people to copy these parents. He actually asked these parents to run cookery classes for the other mothers where the price of admission was bringing along some freshwater shrimps and some of the greens. 10 years later, when an evaluation team visited the village, 10 years after Jerry and Monique Sternin had left, there was no malnutrition in the village. But it had worked because they'd followed the bright spot. It wasn't a solution imposed from outside. They started with what was working locally and amplified that and scaled that up. Find the local solutions, follow the bright spots. Script the critical moves. Habit change gets derailed when we get tired. So you have to keep it simple. Weight Watchers understands that. Weight Watchers doesn't say, eat more sensibly. It says 25 points. It's really easy to follow that. And then point to the destination. Ian Vann was the head of exploration for British Petroleum in 1980. And he discovered that BP's exploration costs were $5 a barrel. Their competitors were finding oil for $1 a barrel. And he said, we have to match our competitors. BP's success rate was 20%. So the maths is simple. If we're going to match our competitors, we're going to have to get up to 100%. No dry holes. So he announced this as the goal for the organization, no dry holes. And people said, that's crazy, that's stupid. You can't possibly get no dry holes. There'll always be some misses. And he said, nevertheless, that's the goal. It's what Jim Collins calls a big, hairy, audacious goal. And people said, that's stupid. But Ian Vann said, nevertheless, that's the goal. And the internal culture of the organization changed. Nobody wanted to be the first person that month to hit a dry hole. So they got more surveys. The explorers became geophysicists. They resisted pressure from governments to drill when the prospects weren't good. And over the next 10 years, BP's success rate went up from 20% to 70%. They didn't reach the goal, but they made far more progress than they would have made had they just actually played safe. The next three strategies focus on the emotional side of habit change. Find the feeling. Make that emotional connection. John Stegner, at one time, was head of procurement for the Delphi automotive chain of factories. They make car parts in America. And one summer, he got a summer intern to do some little research project for him to find out how many different kinds of pairs of protective gloves the organization was buying across their 23 factories. And so this intern found, by going through the invoices, that actually this company was buying 424 different kinds of protective glove. And he'd raised this issue before, basically we're wasting money by not buying these things in bulk. And he knew what would happen. People say, yes, something must be done, and nothing would get done. So one board meeting, he snuck in before the board meeting took place, and he piled up 424 pairs of gloves on the boardroom table, each one tagged with the factory that had bought it and the price they'd paid. And so the vice presidents came in expecting to see a board table with water, carafes, and papers, and saw this big pile of 424 pairs of gloves. And they looked at the prices, almost identical gloves, $17, $5. And that day, they agreed they were going to change how they bought gloves. But it was the emotional appeal of the 424 pairs of gloves that made the difference, not the value for money argument. Shrink the change. If we tell the teachers they've got to teach like people in Shanghai or Finland or Germany or whoever the latest flavor of the month is, they're going to say, what's the point? How can I do that? The change seems overwhelming. So don't ask people to change quickly. Shrink the change. When I retired from the University of London 5 years ago, I had a big problem. Over a 30-year career as an academic, I'd accumulated a lot of paper, photocopied journal articles. I actually had four-drawer filing cabinets full of them. I estimated if I piled them up in a pile, it would actually be 10 meters high. And I had a problem because I traveled so much, I needed them scanned. I needed to scan 10 meters of paper. I couldn't face it. So I decided to set myself a different task. Scan 1 centimeter of paper a day. So every day I was in my home office, I had to scan 1 centimeter of paper. And when that centimeter is scanned, you're done. 3.5 years later, the job was finished. It's all scanned and backed up on 2 continents. But the important point is this. I wouldn't have had the courage to start the task if I thought about it as scanning 10,000 documents. But scanning a centimeter of paper is straightforward. Those of you with teenage children, you know how hard it is to get them to tidy their bedrooms. Because to them, the task seems impossible. So don't ask them to tidy their bedrooms. Ask them to tidy up for 5 minutes. Set the timer on your phone, pick up your room for 5 minutes, and when the buzzer goes, you're done. Stop. Tomorrow there'll be another 5 minutes, but today you're done. Shrink the change. Make it seem possible. And then grow your people, the idea of mindset that I mentioned earlier. The last 3 strategies relate to tweaking the environment. Brian Wansink has done lots of research on people's eating habits. And in 1989, he commandeered a Chicago movie theater for a little experiment around eating habits. It was, in fact, the Chicago premiere of Mel Gibson's film Payback, in case you're interested. And they chose the 1:15 showing so that people wouldn't be hungry. So as people arrived in the movie theater, they were offered free tubs of popcorn in exchange for some evaluations. They said, we're evaluating the franchises here. Here's some free popcorn. We'd be grateful if you filled in a questionnaire at the end of the movie. People took this popcorn, went in, watched the film. There were 2 things they didn't know. One was that the tubs either had 4 ounces or 8 ounces of popcorn. So they looked identical, but some contained 4 ounces of popcorn, some contained 8 ounces of popcorn. The other thing they didn't know was the popcorn had been prepared 7 days earlier and kept in sterile conditions so that it was really, really stale. It was squeaky stale. One person later described it as like eating styrofoam packing peanuts. So at the end of the movie, these people come out with their popcorn tubs, they hand them over to the researchers, they fill in their questionnaire, and the researchers weighed the tubs. The people who had been given 4 ounces of popcorn, on average, ate 2 ounces of popcorn. The people who've been given 8 ounces of popcorn, on average, ate 3 ounces of popcorn. 50% more of this nasty, stale popcorn just because they've been given more. What was really interesting was people were asked in the questionnaire, were you influenced in how much you ate by the amount of popcorn you were given? And everybody said, no, I wouldn't be influenced by that, but people were. So, tweak the environment, build habits. In Barack Obama's first election campaign, they tried a rather interesting piece of nudge psychology. So as you know, campaigners for candidates ring up potential voters. Going to vote for our candidate? Yeah, good. Don't forget to vote. Typical phone call. At random, for half of the conversations where they rang people up, they said 2 extra sentences, or 2 extra questions. What will you have been doing before you vote? Where will you be coming from when you vote? Just asking people to think that through. And the people who had those extra 2 questions were 11 percentage points more likely to turn up on the day if they voted on their own. If they voted with other people, it didn't actually have any effect. But this is an action trigger. It helps you do the things you want to do. And finally, rally the herd. Becky Richards is Director of Clinical Services in the Kaiser Permanente chain of hospitals in Northern California. And one of her worries was the number of medication errors happening in her hospitals. So typically about 1 in every 1,000 medications administered in hospitals has an error in it that's non-trivial. And obviously, that's very serious. So they tried to discover why this was happening. And what they discovered was the nurses were being disturbed when they were doing these drug dosage calculations. So Becky Richards suggested they created free spaces in hospitals. The idea was that when you're doing the drugs round, you wheel the drug trolley into this area, which is on a red tile floor, and the nurses doing the drug dosage calculations had to put on a high luminosity day glow vest with medication round, do not disturb, written on the back. Everybody hated it. The doctors hated it because they couldn't just call in on how's so-and-so doing. The nurses hated it because they thought it was demeaning. They thought it said they couldn't do their jobs. They found their vests hard to get on and off. They couldn't keep them clean. And the nurses were on the point of rebelling when the data came in. The number of drug dosage miscalculations had dropped by over 60%, just by giving nurses time to do their jobs properly. So these are the 9 strategies for habit change. And what I suggest, therefore, is that if we want to do this in teaching, we need to adopt similar strategies for helping teachers change. So here is a slide that shows how I think these strategies can be applied in teacher learning in your school. Follow the bright spots. Start with volunteers. If you try to change everybody at the beginning, there'll be loads of resistance to saying, this won't work here, this won't work in this school. But it's much harder for people to say that if it's working in the classroom next door. So find the people who want to make it work and support them and bring the conscripts along later. Script the critical moves. Left to their own devices, teachers will chat forever. So that's why I think we need to have very highly scripted meetings. Point to the destination. When I moved to the United States in 2003, they just introduced this new law called No Child Left Behind. I thought, what a stupid title. No Child Left Behind. Can you imagine the pressure on the last kid? But now I understand it's a big, hairy, audacious goal. You know, No Child Left Behind is a far stronger rallying cry than not more than about 1 or 2 million children left behind. And so, you know, in terms of attainment challenge, you know, every child proficient, I think, is a good rallying cry. We may not get there in the same way that BP did not get to no dry holes, but the fact is we'll have far more impact if we set that out as our goal, if we don't accept failure at the outset. Find the feeling. One of the things I do whenever I talk to teachers is to reconnect them with that moral imperative, the reason they became teachers in the first place. Remind them, I want you to get better, not because HMI is coming, but because it makes a difference to the children that you teach. It makes a difference to their lives. Reconnecting them with that moral imperative. Allowing teachers to take small steps. Allowing teachers to just work on one thing. This thing I do to get groups to be quiet, I saw a drama teacher using that. I thought, that's what I want to do. Schools have got different policies. Some of them are horrible. Some of them have these teachers clapping, so kids, they go, and the kids have to respond and say, that's horrible. Disruptive, disrespectful. Other things are countdowns. 3, 2, 1. The kids have to be quiet. Awful. I'm a big fan of The Dog Whisperer. Okay? I don't know if you watch that program. I think it's wonderful. I think every teacher should watch The Dog Whisperer because it's all about calm, assertive energy. Yeah? So I saw this, I thought, I want to do that. That's what I want to do. It took me 6 months to the point where I did not feel like an idiot. It took me another 6 months to get to the point where it's second nature. I don't have to think about it anymore because it's who I am as a teacher. But it took me a year to get to that point. If we want to produce lasting change, lasting improvements in our teachers, we have to allow them to take small steps. We have to allow them to do the practice and practice and practice that expertise requires. Because if teachers move on before something is second nature, they'll stop doing it. And that's why we had so little cumulative change in the past. We haven't allowed teachers to take small steps. And then grow your people, the idea of mindset for teachers, not for children. And then time for teacher learning, building teacher learning time into the school calendar. The professional development is not something that happens every 5 days a year. It's something that happens in the natural cycle of the work of the school, creating routines and structures, and that creating that group idea. We're making mistakes, we're trying things. And this slide summarizes what we've learned in setting up over 2,000 teacher learning communities all over the world, from New Zealand and Australia to Singapore and Sweden, the UK, US, and Canada. And what I find interesting about this slide is that we got just about everything wrong to begin with. So we started with groups of 4 and 5. Based on critical friendship groups, it's too small. To get great conversations, you need larger groups. We thought originally we should start with conscripts, volunteers is better. We thought originally we should have early years teachers in one group, upper primary in another group. Actually, mixed groups are far better. Because when you're talking about pedagogy, any teacher can learn something from any other teacher. We tried originally to have meetings every 2 weeks. Doesn't work. It's too frequent. Most teachers take a month to try anything new in their classrooms. People who've never been teachers don't understand that. If you've never been a teacher, you don't understand how delicate and fragile teachers' working lives are. And once that new school year rolls around, you climb back on board that roller coaster, just staying aboard is pretty hard, and doing anything new is really, really difficult. So that's what we discovered, is that actually meetings once a month is about the most you can have if teachers are going to have time to actually try out new ideas. The other thing we decided, by looking at professions elsewhere, was the idea of having a repeated structure. Lee Shulman talks about the signature pedagogies of the professions. What he points out is that if you go to law school anywhere in North America, it'll look exactly the same. It'll look like this. How they teach law in just about every country in the world looks very similar. You go and train as a doctor anywhere in the world, you will do this thing called rounds. Can you imagine a medical student saying to the consultant, what are we doing tomorrow? Rounds, says the consultant. The student says, really? Rounds? We did rounds today. Can we do something different tomorrow? No. Rounds tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that. Here's the important point. A signature pedagogy means that the structure becomes familiar, so the professional learning comes into the foreground. If you change the structure of the meeting at each meeting, people spend the first part of the meeting trying to figure out what they're meant to be doing. So we suggest a signature pedagogy, and the idea is that every meeting has the same structure. Now, this is a structure that I would recommend, but you can make up your own. But I think the important point is, if you're going to have teachers coming along and talking about what they're doing, you don't want to be changing the structure every single time. For this particular model, we call activities 1, 2, 3, 5, and 6 the bookends, because they're the same at every meeting. They become familiar, a routine that gets people focused on their learning rather than the structure. In setting up these groups all over the world, we discovered that teachers are not particularly good at playing nicely with each other. Teachers don't actually have much expertise or practice in collaboration. So I think we have to model it for them. We have to actually get them to talk about how they're going to work as a group. So we find the work of Garmston and Wellman very useful here. The important point is that each group sets its own norms of collaboration. So, you might talk to them about the importance of pausing and paraphrasing and probing. The important point is, like most things, the more you think about it, the more you practice it, the better you get. Make it an explicit part of the group's work. We discovered it's very useful to get started with some learning intentions. You might expect that. We also think it's very useful to get teachers just talking at the beginning of the meeting. So we offer a number of starters. Think of something you're looking forward to this year, something a student did that made you smile. In very challenging schools, we've also found it useful to let teachers let off steam. A 30-second rant about all the things that bugs you about your job. If you're going to do that, take a stopwatch. Because they will need to be stopped at 30 seconds. Why can that be valuable? Because if there are issues bubbling under the surface that you don't address, they'll just keep on bubbling up through the meeting. So surface them. So typically what happens, I did this in one group in Cleveland in North America, Cleveland, Ohio. Very dysfunctional school, lots of unhappiness. The first month, every single teacher needed to be stopped at 30 seconds. Second month, about half the teachers passed. The third month, practically everybody passed. But the important point is we're not pretending these things aren't issues. We're going to get them on one side so we can focus on your professional learning. The active ingredient is feedback. So the idea is that each teacher at each meeting promises the group what they're going to try, and the next meeting they come back and report on it. And this is the active ingredient. This is the thing that teachers have told us makes them change their practice. Knowing that they're going to be reporting back to their colleagues about how something went in a month's time is what makes them prioritize this over everything else. So people come to the meeting knowing they're sharing their experiences, they're ready to offer feedback to their colleagues, and the other point is keeping the learning focused on formative assessment, challenging ideas that may be good practice but aren't related to formative assessment, because the formative assessment is what connects you to the research base. If you're not doing formative assessment, you don't have any guarantee it's going to improve student achievement. Activity 4, we call new learning about formative assessment, and this was added quite late on. What we found was that If you don't have any variety in the meetings, it gets a bit boring. So we think that each meeting should have something novel. You can either do a book study, watch videos of classroom practice, a drip feed of new formative assessment techniques. But the important point is there's something new at every meeting. And then the other active ingredient, personal action planning time. 15 minutes to sharpen the saw. Most teachers never get 15 minutes of quiet time to think about how they're going to be a better teacher next month than you are this month. If you're at home, your family's making demands. If you're at school, there's always a student or a colleague wanting your time. The idea is we carve out 15 minutes once a month for each teacher to reflect, how will I be a better teacher next month than I was this month? And that seems to me to be very important. Then finally, the wrap. Did we achieve our aims? If yes, great. If no, what should we do about it? Now, these groups obviously need leaders, and people ask us, how should we train these leaders? My advice, don't. When the people running these groups think they're experts on formative assessment, they end up telling others what to do. We've seen teachers in their second year of teaching being truly outstanding in the leaders of these groups because they know they don't have the answers. There are no experts in this group. Somebody once pointed out this has got more in common with Alcoholics Anonymous than it has with other models of professional development. This is like-minded professionals getting together for mutual support. So the leader does need to organize the meeting, does need to keep the agenda on track, does need to maintain a collegial and supportive environment, but that person isn't there to be the formative assessment expert. And then finally, a quick word about peer observation. Now, the term peer observation is used in some schools to describe a process that I would call performance management. Superiors checking up on subordinates. Now, that needs to happen. Every school needs to have bosses checking up on subordinates. Here's the problem. It doesn't improve performance very much because people cover up. I was helping a school prepare for an inspection. So the idea was we'd actually sort of simulate an inspection. So I went in, watched this lesson. It's all right. And then spoke to the students. What do you think of that lesson? And one boy said to me, it was good. Better last week. Knowing he was being observed by somebody from outside, this teacher had chosen to teach the same lesson a second time to the same class because it had gone so well. That's what happens when people think they're being evaluated. Summative drives out formative. And so, I think you need to be monitoring what's happening in the school. You need to be checking up on the standards of teaching, but you need a different process below the radar where genuine peers get together. So if Carol comes into my classroom for genuine peer observation, I tell her what to look for. I'm trying to improve my wait time. I give her a stopwatch. I ask her to measure my wait times. And here's the clincher. Any notes she makes in my classroom belong to me. By making it clear that the person being observed owns the process and owns any notes that are made, it clearly distinguishes it from performance management. Performance management needs to happen, but we need to keep the processes apart because summative almost always drives out formative. So the idea of peer observation being run to the agenda of the observed, not the observer, with the person being observed in charge of the process, considerably lessens the stakes, and coincidentally also assuages a lot of union concerns. Because this is about a professional agenda for improvement with like-minded equals getting together for that purpose. Okay, so just, I've talked about this idea, 75 minutes once a month for teachers to work together on improving their practice. Is this going to be feasible in your schools? Just spend a minute thinking about whether this is actually going to be feasible. Can you find 75 minutes once a month for your schools?